Morning my husband handed me divorce papers across the breakfast table, I was still in my hospital gown. Not metaphorically. Literally. I had been discharged from Cedars-Sinai exactly 48 hours earlier after emergency surgery on a ruptured ovarian cyst, and I was still moving like someone had scooped out my insides. Because someone had. I had a 7-inch scar held together with surgical staples, a prescription for painkillers I could barely afford to fill, and a husband who had apparently spent the 2 days I was unconscious consulting with a divorce attorney. He set the envelope on the table next to my coffee cup. He didn't look at me when he did it. "I think it's better we handle this now," he said, "before things get complicated." I remember staring at that envelope for a long time. The return address had a law firm's name on it. I remember thinking, he planned this. He had the name of the firm memorized. He knew the zip code. This was not a man who had made a decision in the last 48 hours. This was a man who had been waiting for the right moment. And apparently, the right moment was when I could barely stand up straight. His name was Felix. We had been married for 6 years. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because I think it matters. Felix was not a monster when I married him. He was funny and steady, and he made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like someone had chosen me specifically. Not by accident, not out of convenience, but deliberately. His family was warm and loud, and they pulled me into holiday dinners and birthday parties, and I told myself, this is what having a family feels like. I had grown up with a mother who worked doubles at a diner in Bakersfield and a father who I only knew through a POET box address that stopped receiving letters when I was 9. I had always been someone who existed slightly outside of warmth. Felix felt like finally walking through a door I had been standing outside of for years. The problem was that I had not understood, when I walked through that door, that the warmth came with conditions. His mother's name was Lorraine, and from the very first Thanksgiving I attended as Felix's girlfriend, she had a specific way of looking at me. Not unkind, exactly. More like she was appraising something, checking for flaws before deciding whether it was worth keeping. She asked about my family twice at that first dinner, the second time right after I had explained there wasn't much to speak of. And both times there was a small pause after my answer that I chose to interpret as sympathy. It took me 4 more years to understand it was something closer to contempt. Felix's family had money. Not obscene wealth, but the comfortable carpeted kind that makes certain people believe they exist on a different plane of judgment than everyone else. His father owned a chain of auto dealerships across the Central Valley. His older brother Donovan had gone to USC on their dime, and now ran one of the locations in Fresno. Felix himself had done 2 years of business school before deciding he preferred to invest, their word, in real estate partnerships, which from what I could tell mostly meant attending dinners with men who talked about real estate. I was a physical therapist. I had put myself through school on loans and a part-time job at a sporting goods store, and sheer, grinding stubbornness. I made decent money. I was not embarrassed by what I did or what I came from. But I also understood, slowly, over the course of 6 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and Felix's mother casually mentioning other women he had dated, women with family names that meant something, women whose parents belonged to the right clubs, that in Lorraine's ledger, I had never quite balanced out. Felix defended me. I want to give him that. In the early years, he defended me, but defenses erode, and I think what happened, gradually, was that living inside his family's version of reality became easier than maintaining his own. It's a quiet kind of erosion. You don't notice it until you reach for the person you married and find something slightly different standing in his place. By year 4, he had stopped correcting his mother when she made comments. By year 5, he had started making them himself. Small things. A raised eyebrow when I mentioned a patient I particularly loved working with. Someone elderly, or uninsured, or difficult. A comment about whether my clinic was really the best use of my license, whether I'd considered something more lucrative. Private practice. Sports medicine for a wealthier clientele. I kept saying I liked what I did. He kept looking at me like liking what you did was a charming but ultimately impractical position. The surgery happened in February. A cyst I had known about for 2 years had finally ruptured, and I had woken up at 3 in the morning unable to breathe through the pain, and Felix had driven me to the ER with the specific, focused calm of a man who was already somewhere else in his head. He visited once while I was inpatient, brought flowers, the gas station kind, still in the plastic sleeve, and sat in the vinyl chair next to my bed scrolling his phone for 40 minutes before saying he had a call he needed to take. I told him it was fine. It was not fine, but I had spent 6 years learning how to make things fine that weren't, and I was very good at it by then. So when I opened that envelope at the breakfast table, the morning light coming through the kitchen window and my surgical site pulling with every breath, I was not entirely surprised. I was devastated, but I was not surprised. Those are two different things, and I think people sometimes confuse them. He left for a work trip to Sacramento that same afternoon. He had apparently planned that as well. I sat in our kitchen. His family's kitchen, technically, since the house was in his name. Something his mother had insisted on before we married, and which Felix had explained to me as simply practical, and I read through the divorce filing. It was thorough. His attorney had been methodical. Everything was structured to move quickly. Felix was asking for a speedy resolution, no contested assets, no drawn-out proceedings. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was what had arrived in my personal email inbox 3 days earlier, while I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from surgery. My biological father's attorney had been trying to reach me for 6 weeks. My father, it turned out, had not simply abandoned my mother and me when I was 9. He had left Bakersfield and built a life in Portland, Oregon, a real one, a manufacturing business that had grown for 25 years into something significant and then been acquired, the previous year, by a larger firm in a deal that had generated a settlement requiring distribution to his legal heirs. He had no other children. He had never remarried. He had, according to the very careful language of the letter from his estate attorney, attempted to locate me on multiple occasions. He had died 4 months before I ever read that letter. A stroke, quiet and fast, at 61. He never knew if I had received any of it. His estate, after all applicable taxes and legal fees and the provisions for several charitable organizations he had designated, left me with an inheritance of just under $2.3 million. I read that number in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm and a roommate behind a curtain watching Wheel of Fortune, and I genuinely thought I was hallucinating from the anesthesia. I was not hallucinating. I spent the first week after coming home doing nothing but sleeping and rereading the documents and calling the estate attorney, a precise and patient woman named who explained everything to me 3 times without irritation. I did not tell Felix. I had meant to. I had told myself I would tell him as soon as I felt stronger, as soon as the right moment came, and then the envelope arrived on the breakfast table, and I understood that there was no right moment coming. The moment had already passed. It had passed somewhere in the previous 6 years quietly, while I was busy pretending things were fine. I hired my own attorney before I signed anything. A woman out of Pasadena who had been recommended to me by a colleague at the clinic, and who looked at the divorce filing Felix's attorney had prepared and then looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said, "They were in a hurry, weren't they?" She was not in a hurry. The first person who called me after Felix's family found out about the inheritance was his mother. I still do not know precisely how she learned. My best guess is that estate proceedings generate public filings, and someone, one of the dealership's accountants, perhaps, or a friend of a friend with a Pacer subscription, had seen something. Whatever the mechanism, Lorraine knew. And the version of Lorraine who called me on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after her son had handed me divorce papers, was not the version who had spent 6 years appraising me like a second-hand coat. She called me sweetheart. She had never called me sweetheart once in 6 years of Thanksgiving dinners. She said she was worried about me. She said the divorce had been so sudden, and she wanted me to know she had always thought of me as a daughter. Truly, and that she hoped I knew her door was always open. She said, and I remember this very precisely because I wrote it down immediately after we hung up, that she had always believed Felix had made a mistake, that I had been good for him, and that she thought with the right conversations, the right environment, things could perhaps be repaired. I thanked her for calling. I said I needed time to think. I did not tell her that, while she was speaking, I had been sitting at my kitchen table watching my phone's screen fill up with notifications. By the end of that week, I had received 41 missed calls. Felix, his mother, Donovan, Felix's father, who in 6 years of marriage had spoken to me perhaps 30 words total and who now left a 2-minute voicemail about family and commitment and working through difficulties. 2 of Felix's cousins I had met a handful of times, a family friend who ran in the same social circles and who had absolutely no reason to have my number except that someone had given it to her specifically so she could call. Felix's messages moved through a predictable arc. The first ones were measured. He just wanted to talk, no pressure. He had been thinking, and he may have acted rashly. The middle ones were warmer and nostalgic, full of memories I recognized from our actual life together, deployed now as evidence for a case he was building. The later ones had a different quality, a tightness underneath the warmth. He mentioned the house. He mentioned the investments he had made during our marriage, the real estate partnerships, the ones I had never been asked to participate in but which he now seemed to feel had been a joint endeavor. He mentioned very carefully that divorce proceedings could become complex when one party experienced a significant change in financial circumstances during the process. I forwarded every voicemail to my attorney. She called me back within the hour. I could hear the quality of her silence before she spoke, the kind that means someone is choosing their words. Then she said, "Good, keep forwarding everything." My clinic had a small office in the back with a door I could close, and I spent a lot of lunch breaks in that office during those weeks. I was not sleeping well. The surgical site had healed clean, but I was still moving carefully, still waking up some nights with a sharp reminder that my body had been through something. I had told my coworkers about the divorce, but not about the inheritance, and there was a specific loneliness in that, in receiving a volume of concern that was genuine and kind but oriented toward the wrong wound. The one person I told was my colleague Zoe. We had worked together for 3 years, and she had the specific quality of a person who reacts to surprising information by getting very quiet and then asking exactly the right practical question. When I told her, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Have you moved the money yet?" I had not. Recalled the estate attorney that afternoon from my car. Felix's attorney made a formal discovery request 6 weeks into the proceedings, which my attorney had anticipated and prepared for. What they found was that the inheritance had been received prior to the filing of the divorce petition, which under California law meant it was separate property, not subject to division, provided it had not been commingled with marital assets. It had not been commingled. I had been meticulous, at my attorney's direction, about ensuring that it wasn't. Felix's attorney pushed back. There were letters, there were suggestions about contribution to the marital estate, about indirect benefit, about theories that struck me as things invented by someone who had started from a desired outcome and was working backwards. My attorney responded to each one with the particular economy of language that I had come to recognize as her version of amusement. The deposition was a Thursday in April in a conference room in Century City with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Hollywood Hills. Felix sat across from me for the first time since the morning he had left for Sacramento. He looked older than I remembered. Not dramatically, just around the eyes, the particular aging that happens to people when they realize that a plan they were very confident in is not going to work the way they thought. His attorney asked me questions for 2 hours. My attorney objected to a number of them. I answered the ones I was instructed to answer. At one point, Felix's attorney implied, with practiced casualness, that I had known about the inheritance before the divorce filing, that the timing of my father's estate proceedings suggested prior knowledge that I had concealed. My attorney requested a brief recess. We stepped into the hallway. She looked at me and said, "You have documentation of every communication from that estate office, correct?" I said yes. She nodded once. We went back inside. The case settled 5 weeks later. Felix received nothing from the inheritance. He retained the house, which was in his name. I retained my car, my retirement accounts, and my separate property. I also retained, though this was not in any legal document, a very clear understanding of exactly who I had been married to and exactly who his family was. I did not respond to any of the 41 calls. I did not respond to Lorraine. I did not respond to Donovan or to Felix's father or to the family friend who had been given my number. I had my attorney send a formal letter to Felix's attorney requesting that all contact go through legal counsel, and then I changed my personal cell phone number for the first time in 8 years. I want to tell you about the moment I remember most clearly from that whole period, because it wasn't the deposition or the settlement or even the morning with the divorce papers. It was a Sunday in March, about 6 weeks after everything had started. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store in Silver Lake, about to go in and buy food for one person for the first time in 6 years, and I started to cry. Not about Felix exactly, not about the money or the surgery or the 41 calls, just about the amount of time I had spent being someone who made things fine that weren't. All those years of quiet adjustment, of smoothing my own edges to fit a space that had never been cut for me. All that careful management of other people's comfort at the cost of my own. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes. Then I went inside and I bought whatever I actually wanted, without consulting anyone, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. The inheritance did not solve my life. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this sometimes flatten into a cleaner arc than the reality earns. Money is not therapy. $2.3 million does not automatically correct 6 years of learned smallness. I still flinched sometimes when my phone rang. I still caught myself for months auto-translating my own preferences into what someone else would find acceptable before I let myself have them. That's the thing about long-term adaptation to a toxic environment. It doesn't just live in the big dramatic moments. It lives in the micro-reflexes. In the way you pause before speaking. In the way you apologize before you've even done anything. What it did give me, the money, was options. And options, it turns out, are what the absence of options had been stealing from me for years. I gave my notice at the clinic 8 months later, not because I no longer love the work, I still love it, genuinely, but because I had been wanting to open my own practice for 4 years and had never had the capital and had never let myself want it out loud. Because wanting things out loud had a way of ending in Felix's particular kind of raised eyebrow. I found a space in Atwater Village, small, good light, close to a park. I spent 3 weeks painting it myself with a college friend who drove up from San Diego specifically to help, and who brought her terrible taste in podcasts and her entirely excellent taste in paint colors, and I opened on a Thursday in October. I run a sliding scale for a third of my patients. It was the first business decision I made, and I made it before I had signed my lease. I'd spent a year of my marriage being made to feel vaguely embarrassed about caring whether people who couldn't afford good care got it anyway. I was done being embarrassed about that. The first Christmas after the divorce I spent in Portland. Not to visit family. I didn't have family there, but I had found, through the estate proceedings, that my father had been involved with a mentorship organization for first-generation college students, and his attorney had passed along my contact information to the organization's director, in case I wanted to know where his philanthropic commitments had been. I flew up there to meet her. Her name was Paula, and she was 70 years old and had known my father for the last decade of his life, and she told me things about him I had no other way of knowing. He had talked about me, she said. Not often and not in detail, because I think there was grief in it that he didn't know how to carry in public. But he had mentioned more than once that he had a daughter he hoped was doing well. That he had mentioned more than once that he had made mistakes he couldn't undo. That he hoped somehow she was okay. I made a donation to the organization in his name. A substantial one. I sat in Paula's office afterward and looked out at the gray Portland sky and tried to locate what I was feeling, and what I found was not the grief I had expected, but something stranger and more complicated. Something that felt, if I'm being careful about the word, like being seen. By someone who couldn't see me anymore. Better late than never is a hollow phrase until the moment it isn't. Felix remarried 11 months after our divorce was finalized. I know because Zoe, who has the specific loyalty of someone who will never tell you something you don't need to know, but will also never let you be blindsided, texted me a heads up. I was at my clinic. I put down my phone and saw my next patient, and then later that evening I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and waited to feel something significant, and found that what I mostly felt was tired, and then fine, and then genuinely fine. Lorraine sent me a card when she found out I had opened my own practice. No note inside, just her name signed at the bottom in her precise, controlled handwriting. I looked at it for a moment, and then I filed it in my recycling bin, which felt honestly like exactly the right amount of response. Here is what I know now that I did not know 6 years ago, sitting across from Felix at a Thanksgiving table while his mother appraised me like something she might send back. The people who are supposed to love you without conditions will sometimes love you only within them. And when you discover this, there will be a period longer than you expect, where you will keep trying to locate the unconditional version you were promised, keep adjusting, keep smoothing yourself down, keep making fine what isn't. This period is not a failure. It is just what happens when someone with a genuine capacity for love encounters people who have decided that love is a resource to be managed rather than offered freely. The surgery that cracked my life open was not the one at Cedars-Sinai. The surgeon who performed that one was skilled and kind and called me 3 days post-discharge to check on my pain levels, which was more contact than my husband made in the same period. The surgery that actually changed things was the one I performed on myself, slowly, over the following year. The removal of every adaptation I had built around other people's comfort at the expense of my own. That surgery has no discharge date. I am still, in small ways, recovering from it. But I am recovering. That's the thing I want you to hear. 41 missed calls, and not one of them was from someone asking how I was doing after the surgery. Think about that. 41 calls, and every single one of them was about what I had, not who I was. That kind of clarity is painful, and I would not wish the process of arriving at it on anyone. But once you have it, once you have seen that clearly, you cannot unsee it. And you are finally, after years of approximating it, actually free. If you've ever found yourself making fine what wasn't, adjusting yourself smaller to fit a space that was never built for you, waiting for the unconditional version of something you were always only getting conditionally, I see you. I was you. The door you've been standing outside of, the warm one that always seems slightly out of reach, is not locked from the outside. It never was. You build it yourself from the inside with every boundary you decide you are finally worth keeping. There's something I kept coming back to in the months after everything settled, something I couldn't quite name at first. Felix had stood in that kitchen with a prepared legal envelope while I was still moving like someone held together with staples, because I was. And what struck me eventually wasn't the cruelty of the timing. It was the confidence. He was confident it would work. Lorraine was confident that one phone call, one well-placed sweetheart, would be enough to walk back 6 years of appraisal and contempt. Donovan called. Felix's father called. 41 people picked up their phones and dialed, and not one of them paused to ask how the surgical site was healing. That confidence only makes sense if it had been rewarded before, and when I sat with that long enough, I had to be honest with myself. It had been. For years I had accepted the raised eyebrow. I had translated my own preferences into what others would tolerate before I let myself have them. I had been so careful, so accommodating, so relentlessly fine with things that were not fine. And every time I absorbed it quietly, I was teaching everyone around me that absorption was available. That I was a surface that could be pressed without pushing back. What I understand now is that character, real character, the kind that holds under pressure, doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every time I chose honesty over convenience, every time I filed another voicemail to my attorney instead of answering, every time I sat with the discomfort of being misunderstood rather than rushing to smooth it over, I was building something. Not a wall, more like a spine. The thing that lets you stand up straight when someone needs you to stay bent. The intelligence piece was harder for me to claim, because I had spent years in an environment that treated my judgment as something to be gently corrected. Felix's family had a specific way of implying that caring about things like sliding scale fees and elderly patients was charming but not quite serious. I had started to believe in the cellular way you believe things you've been told enough times that my instincts were soft. What the inheritance, the attorney, the deposition, the settlement, what all of it showed me was that my instincts had been right every single time. I had simply been convinced to distrust them by people who benefited from my self-doubt. There's nothing more expensive than discounting your own clear thinking, because someone with a nicer house made you feel uncertain. And then there's the matter of endurance. Not the dramatic kind, Not standing in a thunderstorm, arms wide, refusing to break. The quiet kind. The kind that looks like going to work the day after you read a divorce filing. The kind that looks like sitting in a car in a grocery store parking lot, crying, and then going inside anyway and buying what you actually want. Zoe drove up and helped me paint the clinic walls on a weekend when she had 100 other things she could have done. That's what endurance looks like on both sides. The person who keeps going, and the person who shows up to keep going alongside them. None of what happened to me was fair. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it in lessons or silver linings, because I think the insistence that suffering must be redeemed by wisdom is its own kind of pressure. Some things are just hard, and they leave marks, and you carry them forward. What I can say is that the marks I carry now feel like mine. Not proof of what was done to me. Proof of what I did with it. The door you keep almost reaching. You build it yourself. That's the part nobody tells you. You build it, and you walk through it, and you don't look back to see who finally noticed you were gone.